I have to be behind the lectern because I have notes on my computer. Can you hear me without the mic, or should I put on the mic? Okay. Well, it's such a great pleasure to be here at the first UBC Breath of Life, or as we say in writing, BOLUCB. I'm going to just talk about how the Breath of Life program as a whole got started. And it started in California. California, like British Columbia, is a tremendously linguistically diverse area. So there were at least 80 languages spoken before language loss began. And like British Columbia, there's at least 5 large language families, and then a whole bunch of isolates and small families within those families. So it's tremendously diverse. And the tribes are very small. So frequently we look at places like Hawaii and think, wouldn't it be great to have universities that are totally focused on teaching the language, and to have immersion schools and language nests, but sometimes small tribes just can't handle that. They can't handle these. They don't have control of their schools. They may not even have a physical community, and they also don't. Universities can't really focus on 80 languages and be able to teach them all. There's no teachers for them, for one thing. So it's just a different situation in diverse areas than it is in places like Hawaii or New Zealand or Ireland, where the endangered language is the only minority language of the country, other than immigrant languages, which we usually leave out much too, which is problematic for them. But for indigenous languages, if there's only one in a whole state or in a whole country, they have access to resources that we don't have in areas of such diversity. So in 1992, there was a meeting of community scholars from about 50 different language groups. It was called together by a new group that was called Native California Network. And Native California Network wanted to know how could Native California Network be useful to languages. And all of the people that came were working on their language, trying to teach their language, trying to make recordings of their language, but they all were very discouraged. They saw the languages disappearing. And so the end result of that was the founding of a committee of Native California Network that came to be called the Advocates for Indigenous California Language Survival. So I'm one of the members of what was that committee, and all the other members of that committee are California Indians from all over California. Well, Native California Network folded soon after, and so the Advocates became its own nonprofit. And we've been going now for, well, ever since 1992, which is what, 25 years. And there's several programs that we have, but the first program we developed was the Master Apprentice or Mentor Apprentice program. And But there were members of our committee that kept saying, but wait a minute, we don't have any speakers. There was at least 30 languages that had no speakers at all in 1992. And there's a lot more now that have no living native speakers who learn their language at home. And so probably 40 now have lost their last speakers. So the Breath of Life was developed as a response to this need of people who wanted their language but didn't have any speakers to work with and didn't have really any other recourse. So the University of California at Berkeley has major archives of California Indian languages. Ever since its founding in the late 1800s, when the anthropology department was founded, it considered its duty to, this would be A.L. Kroeber and other people that worked in the anthropology department in the late 1800s and through the 1950s, that they had as part of their mission to document the languages and cultures of California. And by 1950, the Anthro department had kind of stopped that and stopped recording languages. And the linguistics department was founded, and that department too, for the first 20, 30 years of its existence, said that their mission was to document California Indian languages. And Mary Haas, one of the founders of the department, said to her students, every student needs to focus on a language and needs to create a grammar, a dictionary, and a body of texts. Well, the field notes and the recordings for all of this are in the archives now. And I've got to say that the field notes are much more interesting and much more useful than the grammars. The raw data for the grammars is all in those field notes. But they're so much better organized, those field notes are so much better organized for actually learning a language than the grammar that came out of them ever was. So the unpublished materials, I think, are extremely valuable to people of California who are trying to learn their languages, trying to use those materials for language revitalization purposes. So I think it was 1996, I used to think it was 95, but one of those years was the first Breath of Life. And we have 3 archives. One of them is the Bancroft Library, where all the field notes from anthropologists are kept. And not only is it the anthropologists of UC Berkeley that have notes there, but many other anthropologists as well who deposited their notes or where one of the libraries inherited their notes. And as Kim was talking about, what these archives are focused on, they're focused on maintaining these materials, maintaining them safely, and making them accessible. So the Bancroft Library has those field notes. The Hearst Museum of Anthropology has the recordings that have been made, and the Survey of California and Other Indian Languages have the notes from the linguistics department and other people who have put their notes there. So it's a very large collection in the end. And so what we did is what Breath of Life everywhere does, which is to make the notes accessible, have a workshop where people are trained to learn how to find the notes, how to order copies, how to listen to them, and they each get a linguist to work with them so that they can be learning how do you know, what are these 18 different writing systems that these notes are in, and how can we use those, how can we pronounce the language, and also how can we utilize them to understand the grammar of our language and eventually, hopefully, be able to create our own sentences and have our own conversations in our language. So we've been going for 25 years, and or 20 years for Breath of Life, in even years. And then Breath of Life in Washington, D.C. started in 2011. And so this is this summer, a week from now, or a week from the end of this one, is the 5th, is it, Breath of Life in the fourth Breath of Life in Washington, D.C. And there, the archives are the NAA, the National Anthropological Archives, where enormous numbers of field notes from all over North America. And the Library of Congress, which has a smaller collection, but various collections of notes, photos, historical documents, and are also handling a lot of the recordings that have been made. And there was also Breath of Life in Oklahoma, which had a little bit of a different take because this was at the University of Oklahoma, but Mary Lynn was creating an archive there. And so a lot of it was focused more on depositing and doing documentation to put in the archive. And and I don't want to leave out the National Museum of the American Indian, where we spend mornings for having our lectures on linguistics and language revitalization, and which also has their own archive. So there's a lot of traveling because the NAA archive is like, what, 30 miles away, and LOC, the Library of Congress, is about a mile away from the Museum of the American Indian. And so now we come to UBC. The American Philosophical Society is hoping to have a Breath of Life at some point, and we're being visited in DC by people from Australia who are hoping to start Breath of Life there. So so it's a movement. And what's also happening, what happened, let's see, in 1996, when we had the first Breath of Life, if you wanted materials, if you wanted to have copies from the Bancroft Library, for example, you would have to pay 50 cents a page for your copy, because they didn't have the staff or the time or to make the copies, and so it was and it would be so hard to get them. You'd have to remind them all the time. And the Anthropology Museum was even worse. You could order copies, but would you ever get them? Maybe not. And the Survey of California and Other Indian Languages was also, just didn't have the structure to make copies very readily. So it was really frustrating and really hard. But now, with the technology that's at hand, so that everything can be digitized, you don't have to even ask for copies anymore. You can just get them. There's some complications with this, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But we're in the process of making everything available online. So you don't even have to come to Berkeley to be able to look at these materials. So what happens at Breath of Life? It's, for some, the most exciting part of the experience. Actually, for all of us, the most exciting part of the experience at Breath of Life is a bunch of people who have the same kinds of goals and the same kinds of interests working together. The networking is what's the most important part of Breath of Life. It just always has been. It's energy producing, seeing other people and hearing what they're doing, and it's also the second most exciting thing is seeing all these materials, many of them from people's own ancestors, own grandmothers, great-grandmothers. And probably the least exciting is learning the linguistics that it takes to deal with the materials, but that's part of what we do. So what we hope is that people will be able to decipher the materials and to use the information to hear and to reconstruct the language, to understand the grammar, be able to pronounce the words, learn old songs or prayers or stories, learn how to make new sentences, learn how to converse. Now, that you can't do that in 1 week. It may be the beginning of something that will take your whole life, and for many people that's what's happened, is that it's becoming a part of their daily life to use these materials and to do the things that come after you've gotten them. So what effect has Breath of Life and the documentation had? There's, first of all, the participants who come, the community researchers. In California, where the Breath of Life workshops have been going on now for over 20 years, we see a lot of developments in language revitalization around the state where the documentation is central. And I need to go back because I forgot some important things before I get more deeply into that. And that is that Daryl Baldwin has been a very important part of the Berkeley Breath of Life. He came to one of the very early ones and came to several. He brought his children with him. Usually his 2 oldest children, and since he had to learn his language from scratch, from documentation, and is still learning his language from documentation, but he made it a language of his home, and so he's raising kids who, well, his son has told me, he says, I consider myself a native speaker. Says, I'm not really a fluent speaker, but I'm a native speaker. And he is a pretty fluent speaker. And so his children are already carrying on the language to the next generation. So they're just a tremendous inspiration. We also had Jessie Littledoe one year, another tremendous inspiration, who also had to learn her language entirely from documentation and is still learning it and is using it at home and spreading it to her community in many ways. So these people have been important to show what can be done, even if you only have documentation. And if you have speakers and documentation, it's also useful. There's groups like the Yurok tribe in California, where Master Apprentice has led them to have quite a few fluent speakers, but they speak what the elders used to call New Yurok. And New Yurok it's got a lot of differences in pronunciation, it has differences in grammar, and it has differences in vocabulary. And they are making great use of the old documentation now to expand their vocabulary and to find some of the aspects of grammar that they didn't know before. So they're making great use of documentation as well, as many tribes are. So when Breath of Life in DC started, it was started by Lisa Conathan, who had been a linguistic partner several times at Berkeley when she was a graduate student there. And so she set up the program in DC. And after a couple of years, we asked Daryl if he'd like to take over in running the program. And so he's the primary director of the Breath of Life in DC, which is for people of all over North America. So getting back to what the community members who go to Breath of Life have done, we have, I'm just going to give some examples. There's some people who continue the study of documentation to become really proficient in speaking their language. So Vincent Medina, who's a Chochenyo language super learner, I think of him, is one example of somebody who's become very fluent from working with the documentation. These are by, Chochenyo is documented by J.P. Harrington primarily, who has documented many, many California languages early in the 20th century. His materials are all at the Smithsonian in DC, in the National Anthropological Archives. So he's now sort of famous in the Bay Area because he's always asked to come and give blessings, and since the Bay Area is Ohlone homeland. He went to Washington, D.C. when the Pope came and gave, he translated a psalm into Chochenyo and recited it there for the Pope, which was both a source of pride to him and a source of conflict for him in many ways. But, and he and various other Chochenyo learners have started getting together at cafes and having like weekly just conversations with anything that they know, just to be able to speak together and increase using the language, which is considered maybe one of the most important aspects, is that people can learn a language, but do you use it? So using it is the big goal for a lot of people. Other participants have gone on to major in linguistics to develop their skills at handling the materials. So as undergraduates or graduate students, and where in California, where they were once participants in Breath of Life, being assisted by linguistic partners, now they assist others at Breath of Life. And they have various ways of sharing with others what they've learned. So I talked about conversations. There's a couple of people who keep Facebook pages where they, or blogs where they, or word a day blogs or whatever, where they're trying to share what they learn from the archives. And various Chumash languages have developed revitalization in different ways. This is, Chumash has at least 4 or 5 languages that are in that small language family. And for example, the Obispeño Chumash have developed a nonprofit group of their own that has regular language gatherings and ceremonial events relearned from the materials. And some of the Iniseños have advanced far enough to develop immersion classes in the local school. There's 2 Barbareño Chumash young women who are applying to graduate school in linguistics now. Another example, Karina Luna, a Mutsun Ohlone woman, and Robert Geary, an Eastern Pomo man, met at Breath of Life and eventually married. And you know, I used to, when we first started Breath of Life, we named it the Lonely Hearts Language Club. So their marriage invitation was in Mutsun on one side and Pomo on the other side. And Karina developed a very close working relationship with her linguistic partner, which is still lasts today. She says that Natasha is a member of the family. And together they went through every bit of documentation they could find, which is a lot. And there's mission materials, there's Harrington materials, there's other linguists that worked with the very last speakers that passed away by 1920 or so. And they came out with a complete dictionary just a few months ago that they had been working on all these years, that is online, published online in the the LDC, the Language Documentation and Conservation online articles and books. One example that I really enjoyed is there's this excellent school teacher named Cheryl Tuttle who teaches school at the Round Valley Reservation and which has 3 languages. Nobody speaks any of them anymore. And Round Valley could be, actually there's 4 languages there, but unlike here, the languages are completely unrelated to each other too. So no one speaks any of them anymore. So Cheryl came to Breath of Life in 2014 to find documentation on the Wailaki language because her students were yearning for language, her high school students. And so they had a vote, which language will we do first? And they voted that it would be Wailaki. So she came and found quite a few materials, and her linguistic partner worked with her to start developing curriculum for the class. And they continued to work together by Skype for the entire school year, so that an entire year of classes was developed, just keeping ahead of the students 1 week at a time. And they came to one of our conferences and talked in the language, introduced themselves in the language, and they were just so full of enthusiasm and talking about going to college, which is something that people in Round Valley had not done before. So it was just, I think, a tremendous success. So that's some of the ways in which the participants, just some examples of how the participants have used their experience and gone on with it to do great things. But how about the linguists? I've always felt that Breath of Life is a part of the education of linguists, that they learn so much from the community researchers about what, in fact, one of the linguistic partners last night introducing herself said she understands the true meaning of language. And that, I think, is what linguists learn, is the human side of language. And linguists have developed very close relationships with the community people, as I mentioned, with Natasha and the Mutsuns, and with the linguistic partner of the Wailaki participant, and so, and at least 2 of our linguistics graduate students have been influenced by Breath of Life enough to go on to get 2nd degrees in library and information science, and one of those was Lisa Conathan, who now is an archivist at, let's see, she just moved from Yale to another institution, but she's an archivist on the East Coast and the one that developed the Breath of Life in Washington, D.C. We've also had at least one participant, native participant, who went on to get a degree in library science and is now an archivist in Northern California at the archives at Humboldt State University. So, there's a whole new set of ethics over documentation. And it's not that Breath of Life has created this whole new set of ethics, but it's part of the change in linguistic documentation as not being something where a linguist goes in, finds somebody willing to work with him, gets a bunch of material, and leaves forever. but rather it's a contract between communities and linguists or anthropologists over what's going to be done. And it has to, it's a partnership now with communities holding the permission to do or not do it, and where the work has to have value to the communities from the community's point of view. Right? This is a whole new relationship between linguists and speech communities that I think is very important. And Breath of Life has been a part of training for linguists in that new ethic. Well, the archivists have also been influenced by Breath of Life. And when Patricia told me the title of my talk, I emailed the archivists at the Bancroft Library, and I asked them, what influence has Breath of Life had on you guys? And so this is from Lauren Laslaban. She says, Breath of Life has encouraged me and many other Bancroft staff to look beyond our traditional users and uses of our materials, helping us to widen our researcher communities. Breath of Life has been very intellectually and emotionally satisfying for our staff. We've been the witnesses to some great moments in the reading room when researchers have found photographs or field notes made with their own family members. We've become much more knowledgeable about our holdings, which was a big help in putting together the display, for a recent tribal forum that was on campus. I have really enjoyed and have learned a lot by working with individual researchers and groups who have come from as far away as Southeast Alaska to use our collections. Many of them know about us because of Breath of Life. Breath of Life has definitely raised our profile and given us great resonance with some members of the general public. And of course, I must mention how personally fulfilling it has been for me to work with Breath of Life participants. Now, there are some complexities to working in archives. And the main one that I'd like to talk about is intellectual property rights. And I think before Breath of Life, a lot of people felt that the materials in the archives were being hidden away by universities and museums, and that all of this had been taken away from them and wasn't available. And that's one of the important things that the Breath of Life workshops and events have done, is to show people that these materials are available to them, and that they can see them anytime, that they can get copies if they're fierce enough to keep going after the archivists to do the copying. And now, of course, they're available on the web. And I think that the digitization of these archives, both in Washington, D.C. and at Berkeley, has been inspired by the demands of the participants of Breath of Life and other Indigenous people to have access to them. But the trouble with digitization and web access is that it is so public that all of a sudden there's a desire on a lot of Native people to draw back from how public it is. And so there's been some concern and debate over how much access there should be and by whom to materials in the archives. Legally, it's the person or organization who deposited the materials that determines access conditions, which is usually that access is open to the general public. There have been one or two cases where linguists have said that access is subject to permission by the linguist, and that has created a good deal of ill will. but also occasionally tribal entities or families descended from the speakers have wanted to limit access. If they're the depositors, they can, legally. But there's also moral rights. Who has the moral right to limit access? Who makes those decisions? This has been a problem that's been troubling us and archivists for quite some time, and it's getting to be a stronger problem as people are aware of what is available. So I know in Breath of Life we've had tribal councils, well, not that officially, but someone from the tribal council coming and saying, well, you know, those people or that person is not a member of the tribe. He's a descendant of the speaker, but he's not a member of the tribe. He shouldn't have access. And we don't pay attention to that, actually, because it hasn't been official. Because the ICLS, at least, feels that the advocates have a pretty strong feeling that any descendant, at least, should have access to these materials. But not all tribal councils feel that way. And then there's families who do not want members of the family to, or do not want to have anybody have access who are not a member of the family. And that is, again, we have one or two collections at Berkeley where that was at the outset part of the agreement, that that only the family could give permission for use of the materials. And that creates ill will, too, among other descendants or other people whose language that is. There was a conference or a gathering just a month ago, a forum, where 40 tribal communities came to UC Berkeley and wanted to talk about access conditions. And it wasn't that there was any decision made, but there were all kinds of opinions stated. One was that any materials should only be used by when tribal permission is given. Another was that in the interest of NAGPRA, all the material should be given back to the tribes, including the originals. So there was and then there were families saying, look, I don't want my mother's materials to be available on the web for anybody to look at. And so right now I think the archives are in a state where there's two opposing kinds of feelings that are often held by the same people, right? That they should be available, but they should be restricted. And I wanted to end with two poems, if you don't mind, expressing these conflicting points of view. One of them was just sent to me very recently, and I think it was just written by Sherman Alexie. It's called "When She Died, We Buried All of Those Words with Her." My mother was a dictionary. She was one of the last fluent speakers of our tribal language. She knew dozens of words that nobody else knew. When she died, we buried all of those words with her. My mother was a dictionary. She knew words that had been spoken for thousands of years. She knew words that will never be spoken again. She knew songs that will never be sung again. She knew stories that will never be told again. My mother was a dictionary. My mother was a thesaurus. My mother was an encyclopedia. My mother never taught her children the tribal language. Oh, she taught us how to count to 10. Oh, she taught us how to say I love you. Oh, she taught us how to say listen to me. And of course, she taught us how to curse. My mother was a dictionary. She was one of the last 4 speakers of the tribal language. In a few years, the last surviving speakers, all elderly, will also be gone. There are younger Indians who speak a new version of the tribal language. But the last old-time speakers will be gone. My mother was a dictionary, but she never taught me the tribal language, and I never demanded to learn. My mother always said to me, "English will be your best weapon." She was right, she was right, she was right. My mother was a dictionary. When she died, her children mourned her in English. My mother knew words that had been spoken for thousands of years. Sometimes late at night, she would sing one of the old songs. She would lullaby us with ancient songs. We were lullabied by our ancestors. My mother was a dictionary. I own a cassette tape recorded in 1974. On that cassette, my mother speaks the tribal language. She's speaking the tribal language with her mother, Big Mom. And then they sing an ancient song. I haven't listened to that cassette tape in 2 decades. I didn't want to risk snapping the tape in some old cassette players, and I don't want to risk letting anyone else transfer that tape to digital. My mother and grandmother's conversation doesn't belong in the cloud. That old song is too sacred for the internet. So as that cassette tape deteriorates, I know that it will soon be dead. Maybe I will bury it near my mother's grave. Maybe I will bury it at the base of the tombstone she shares with my father. Of course, I'm lying. I would never bury it where someone else might find it. Stay away, archaeologists. Be gone, be gone. My mother was a dictionary. She knew words that have been spoken for thousands of years. She knew words that will never be spoken again. I wish I could build tombstones for each of those words. Maybe this poem is a tombstone. My mother was a dictionary. She spoke the old language, but she never taught me how to say those ancient words. She always said to me, "English will be your best weapon." She was right, she was right, she was right. So here's another poem. Well, I wrote it. I wrote it after the first breath of life. And I wrote it for Linda Yamani, who is a Rumsen Ohlone person. She was one of the people who inspired Breath of Life. And she had been working for many years with the materials from J.P. Harrington. And she was talking about how she doesn't even have time to work on them except at night. So so this is called To the Lonely Hearts Language Club. At night, when the work is done and the children are in bed and the roar of the freeway is quieted and the house cools and darkens and sighs into stillness, she holds in her hands the pages on which rest spidery symbols of sounds whispered by dying grandmothers and written down by a crazed linguist, long dead too, of words spoken for the final time generations ago, entombed now in perpetual silence. The last sound waves decayed into carbon traces in a paper monument to the passing of a language from this earth. Called each night by a power beyond understanding, she lifts a page into her circle of light and begins a ceremony of resurrection. The pencil scratchings that encase the grandmother's gifts fall away and the words reawaken. Her voice frees them one by one and they fly into the night, echoing into and out of corners. The air vibrates with their saying. The world resonates with their being. So those are the two views that are kind of in contrast with each other of what is the future of the archives and of the materials in those archives. And I hope that the world will resonate with their being rather than that they'll be buried. So, okay, thank you. Question?
Yes. Did the army have let you have access to the Navajos when they were communicators for them during the Second World War?
Oh, you mean did the army let linguists have access? I don't know. That's yeah.
Another thing too is, years ago the Cascas were nomads, and they traveled in family groups. We assume the Navajos, which are their language, their dialect is very similar to ours. They're part of the family that went south.
Yeah,
their stories are the elders tell us.
Yeah, it's a really widespread language family, and one of our past board members is Hoopa, which is also related to your languages up here, and we went up to Alaska at one point, and we're working with some of the Athabascan communities up there, and he was finding just almost every word that they could understand each other. Really Peter.
Thank you for what I take also as a contribution from the group in California to all of us. That's what I first hear when you're talking. How much all those people in those communities have struggled and gifted us with many different things. I wanted to acknowledge that first of all. But as a linguist, I'm thinking, and as a community member, I know we try and think in the future about what's going to happen with their notes, but now they have had this experience for the last 25 years. We have notes that we're doing field work for, and we're trying to do the best we can for the future. What are some of the things that community participants are asking, or they wish that they would have had from those notes that maybe are not there?
Oh, yeah.
Help us to be better note takers,
right.
Documenters.
Well, I think this is one way in which documentation has changed a lot. In general, the old notes, they don't have any conversation, right? They don't have, very few archives have recordings of actual conversation between people. And of course, it would have been very difficult to record conversation before recordings were available, and a lot of these notes are from the 19th century. There's at Berkeley we have many wax cylinder recordings, which are the very first recordings that were ever made. But these wax cylinders had problems that each cylinder lasted about 7 minutes or something. It seemed that what was usually recorded was songs. There wasn't very much in the way of actual spoken language recorded. And when it was recorded, it was stories. And then the stories would be interrupted every 7 minutes. And there might not be translation, so that somebody who doesn't know the language would have difficulty understanding. And not to mention that the recordings decay over time and have various problems with re-listening. Every time you play a wax cylinder, it damages it. One of the good news about wax cylinders, though, is that there's a whole new technology that was developed at Berkeley, actually, for digitizing the wax cylinder recordings without touching them. Right? You take a picture of them, essentially, a long video picture, which is put onto the computer directly, and so it never touches it. And even if the cylinder is cracked or something, it can still record everything except that crack, and then you can also edit them so that some of the sound where you don't know whether it's a rattle or a usually the cylinders or something like, you can get rid of that. So they're becoming available. But in any case, I think conversation is one of the things that's lacking. How did people just talk to each other? And the whole creative use of language when joking and all the just the informal ways of speaking and playing with words. You know, none of this was really recorded in the past, and for people doing their own documentation now, there's this great opportunity to, if you still have speakers who talk to each other in the language. You know, the old joke is there's only two speakers and they won't speak to each other. In California, there are several languages where that was the case. But if you have the opportunity to record conversation, I think that's the one thing. Also, though, I mean, just special ways of speaking, like how do you talk to your baby? You know, there's people who are trying to use the language at home who have that. Hey, I want to know how do I change diapers in my language? You know, what are the terms of endearment that I can use? So all of these things are perhaps the most valuable things to record now. Special knowledge has always been recorded, and that's so important too. The knowledge of ceremonies, the religious knowledge, and old stories. These are some of the things that people want to restrict, but and there's reasons. For example, in the National Anthropological Archives, there's a lot of Cherokee material that old medical practitioners, traditional practitioners, wrote down, and the Cherokees believe that's very dangerous for somebody to just know without having the proper training. And it's not that it's restricted, it's not restricted, but there's a warning on it saying, do not look at these materials if you aren't a trained practitioner. No. So,
is that communities can really give a lot back to the archive and to enrich those materials?
say that again?
That community members, when they visit the archives, usually can do a lot for the well-being of those materials themselves. So a similar example was the National Anthropological Archive, the Breath of Life in 2011. I was working with the two Shawnee speakers, and some of the stories we found, they said these are winter stories. You're not supposed to tell these in summertime. And the archivists did not know that. And so a note was made that those were to be shared only in wintertime. And so that knowledge is something that an archivist may not know, but that community members have that knowledge. That definitely makes it for a more culturally appropriate way of disseminating those materials to people who are interested.
Right. But even that brings up questions. Does that mean that if you're there for the summer only, that you cannot have access to the materials, or could you say to yourself and to the librarian, I want access so I can tell these in the wintertime?
I think it was about telling them, not about reading them, but it was definitely about telling them.
Right, right.
In this particular case.
Yes.
Topic of intellectual property rights, I feel like for my language, Papua, we have a lot of problems with people not from our community using our techniques to make art and just like daily objects and stuff. And for me, like that's really sacred what they're doing. And sometimes I even see like people people that aren't from our community carving our stuff, and it's really a touchy subject for me because like they don't even know what they're carving and they're not even from the community, and like they don't know that those things have certain rights to certain families. And like I guess my question is just like, because there are so many, for Kwakula, there are so many instructional steps for making these things that are made available. Like for example, there's like a cedar working book and then like the Kwaki's ethnography. And I find that a lot of the time it's like non-community members using these things to make our objects and profit off of them, which is something I'm really uncomfortable with. And just like, I guess my question is how to like rein in that of people using our techniques and profiting off of it when they're not from our community.
Right. Yeah, I know that. I mean, I've heard that a lot about Northwest Coast art. You know, I have to admit, my father, when his first grandchild was born in around 1960 or something, he loves Northwest art, and so he carved a cradle for his granddaughter using Northwest art. And then he said later in life, he said, "I didn't know, I wasn't supposed to do that."
Yeah.
But and I know I know there's been some solutions up here, not total solutions, but at least of authentic markers that can be put on the art that has been verified as authentic. And but how that fits with language too is that there's certainly people that well, first of all, there's the question: can researchers have access who are not Native people? Can they use those materials? And then there's people will complain sometimes about people of questionable genealogy who are going around making money off of giving lectures about their language and telling stories and so on. And so it also works in language materials as well. And
like for me, I have no problem sharing my language because it's in such a rested state. It just seems to me that they only ever want to be included in my culture when they can make money off of it. And so like I would really like to protect, like, I don't mind sharing like stories and stuff, but I would really like to protect like instructional guides to like making these things because of so many people profiting off of them and stuff. Mm-hmm. And I just wanted to know, like, is that the same as like doing that for language and stuff? Because it seems like that is common now.
Yeah, I think so. Now the recordings have been the more touchy issues, and at Berkeley, the recordings, just to have every copy of the recording says that it cannot be used for commercial purposes, which means making money off of it. So people are, you know, the archivists are afraid of, say, some company coming along and making a CD of a bunch of songs off of the archived materials and selling them for profit and that kind of thing, and so, you know, that's certainly something that is not kosher. Could be subject to a lawsuit if it was done, and so but that's about the only thing that I see other than making the materials not accessible, you know, which scares me. I think that there's enough politics going on within tribes that I've seen people trying not to let other tribal members have access, or people who, as I said before, who are descendants but not tribal members having access.
I have a similar issue with that, but it's not really an issue. It's more or less on the other side, where I feel that you cannot have the language and the art and the culture. You can't have one without the other. You have to have them, all of them. And in order to share the importance of that, they all need to be valued at the same teachings. Not so much like, oh, well, I can't teach you this because there's a possibility that you're going to pass it on to somebody else. And then you can't get your mind so wrapped up in the fact that somebody might maybe profiting from it. I don't know if that's really strong and touchy opinion for me, but it's something where I came from before. Like, I was in that position where I felt like, I'm not going to share this with you because I don't feel like what Kim was saying this morning, like, I don't feel like I'm going to share it with you because you don't have all the right morals and the right ethics and the teachings to take this lesson. So
yeah, and yeah.
So I don't know, it's just like a really, really touchy issue for me too.
Right, and it is for a lot of people. I'm just remembering another example of from our
'cause I was
Pomo
restricted from my
participants
own-
who are ceremonial leaders and saying they don't want copies of the songs to be running around because he's afraid the teenagers are going to make rap music out of it.
Yes, see exactly my point. And,
Right.
And certain people can't access certain stories because it belongs to that family. And I'd be teaching something about whatever we have in the museum, and then something I learned about the totem pole, for example. And we're still learning all this information, so the information is always changing and growing. But people would come through, and then I would be so closely watched on what I was saying and what I was sharing. And there was numerous complaints of people complaining that I was not sharing information properly. But how are you supposed to share information properly when people are not sharing that information to begin with?
Yeah, it's complicated.
It is.
I think we might be going over time here. Yeah, okay, so thank you, everybody. And I hope to have more discussions with people about things like intellectual property rights, because I think it's a very interesting topic.
And we wanted to thank Leanne for her wonderful talk. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm glad thank you.